energy.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. If most of you are here for the conference tomorrow, welcome. And in anticipation of that, there are a lot of people watching this by video, both live and who will be watching the recorded video, and there are no microphones. So to the extent that we can talk one at a time, it will help things. This is a wonderful crowd. Keep coming in. My name is David Swanson. I'm the director of World Beyond War. I'm introducing one of our best authors of books related to war and peace, one of our best organizers of events, one of our best activists and disruptors of powerful people doing misdeeds. I don't even know what Medea Benjamin has accomplished in the past 48 hours because I've been taking the slow route to Toronto, and usually when I'm out of the loop for a couple of days, somebody has started a new war. I think that hasn't happened, but I do know that Medea has disrupted someone engaged in trying to provoke and get a new war started, and I haven't seen it yet, so we're going to watch it together, and we'll watch the clip first, Medea?
I want to talk a bit first.
Okay. Welcome, Medea Benjamin.
So, great thanks to David and the team that put this wonderful conference together. It's so exciting to be in Canada. I know for myself and Ann Wright, who's over there, it's not always easy to get into Canada. Did you have any problems today?
Yeah.
You did. What about you?
Well, we went over the entire list of the numbers of times that we've been arrested, and then denied entry into Canada, and then being able to finally talk our way into Canada over the last 11 years.
Oh, you made it! So, Ann and I, and where's Hockey in the back there from CODEPINK, we've been arrested many times. It actually hasn't been drunk driving or, it's been for civil disobedience around war. And we get a hard time. In fact, we've been denied entry into Canada several times. And the last time I got in, I was almost denied, but the woman said, let me go and look up CODEPINK. And she disappeared for a long time, came back and said, I love what you do. I'm going to put in the record that, see, it's different level. When misdemeanors for us in the U.S., you don't have the same system here. So it's like bumped up to something higher. And she said, I'm going to bump yours down to like traffic tickets. And I said, fabulous. So I didn't expect any problem when I came today, except that I got the secondary, and then I got the tertiary screening, and big X. And then I went in and she said, we've got a little problem here. She said, do you have your papers with you? And I said, well, I just gave you my passport. She said, no, I mean your documents. And I said, what documents? And she says, to prove that you have been rehabilitated. And I said, but I haven't been rehabilitated. So she got very upset, and she looked again, and she said, to get into Canada, you have to prove that any arrests that you've had have been expunged from your record. And I said, how do you do that? And she said, you go to the police in the U.S., which we have tried to do. And they said, hell, we're not going to expunge these from your record. No. Anyway, we had, she went to her supervisor and then the supervisor. And finally she said, we're going to give you 48 hours. And I said, well, I need more than that because I have a talk on Sunday as well. And she said, prove it. And luckily I had the documents to prove it. So she let me in until Sunday. So it's very hard for us to get into Canada. And That is because they share, what's it called, Ann? The
National Crime Information Center database.
National Crime Information Center database. And Canada so far is the only country that has access to that database. But it's a very, very bad and dangerous precedent that we better try to stop, because I don't know about you, Ann, but I certainly don't want to be rehabilitated.
Are you going to be able to get back home?
Yeah, we can get back home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Without being
So far.
But we got stopped going back in.
Oh, we get stuff going back in as well. Yeah.
It's like Mike trying to get into Israel.
Oh, hello there, yes. Getting into Israel is hard. And before I go any further, I want to say there is one Canadian here without whom CODEPINK would not exist. And that is Verita in the back here. Liz here, and from the very beginning has been doing all of the art, the website, the alerts, that if you're signed up, she is the one who designs and does the back end for everything that goes out of CODEPINK. I don't know how she does it all, but she is absolutely amazing, and we are just so happy to have you with us as a great sister in struggle. And so some of you had said that they saw this clip from yesterday and suggested I show it. And I was going to start out showing it because, not because, I'm such a great disruptor, but because of the outpouring that we've received today from people in Iran. And I must say it's one of the times that I've really enjoyed my 15 seconds of fame, because it has been so beautiful to see all day long coming in the streams from Instagram, email. Iranians don't have access to Facebook, so it hasn't been much on Facebook, but just constant, like every second coming in. I have not used Instagram, and now I have thousands of Instagram followers, and reading the messages from all kinds of people, people who like their government, people who hate their government, but all of whom, well, not all of them, some are like, screw you and that kind of stuff, but most of them saying, we have to find a way to stop the war. And so I'm going to play it for you just to give you a taste of that. So this was yesterday, and the guy speaking is the top U.S. Special envoy, they say, for Iran.
It is time for all nations to join us in holding Iran.
1 second more. So he was speaking yesterday at a, quote, think tank, stink tank, in Washington, D.C. And he had just given about a 20-minute talk where he mentioned the word missile, I think, maybe 1,000 times. And it was about how the danger of Iran having missiles, that we had to get out of this nuclear agreement because it wasn't addressing the missile issue, and how Iran is the greatest threat, blah, 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 blah.
To a new level of accountability for its destruction behavior, especially its lawless pursuit of ballistic missiles. Thank you.
The world community wants to keep the Iran nuclear deal. Our allies are the Germans, the French, the British. They want to keep this deal. The world community wants to keep the deal. Let's talk about normal countries. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Is that who our allies are? They are the biggest threat to the world community. And let's talk, you're hurting me. You're actually hurting me. I want to ask, do you think the sanctions are hurting the regime, or are they hurting the Iranian people? They're hurting the Iranian people. You were making a case for a war with Iran. How did the war with Iraq turn out? You're doing exactly the same thing we did in the case of Iraq. We don't want another war in the Middle East. Let's And how dare you bring up the issue of Yemen? It's the Saudi bombing that is killing most people in Yemen. So let's get real. No more war. Peace with Iran. Thing of that whole thing was hearing from Iranians, and that was yesterday. Oh my God! I told you I've been rehabilitated.
So that didn't lead to jail time right then and there.
No, because that was a private institute. They don't want to make a bigger deal of it. And so they did ban me for life from ever coming back. I said, I've been banned from better places. But they they were live streaming this, and they scrubbed out of it the intervention so that you see me coming on stage and then everything's cut out until the questions come. But it was live streamed by C-SPAN. So it got out and out and out, and the foreign minister of Iran put it out. So that, and it was on Iranian television. So it went all to many places. And the responses have been so interesting because people are talking about the hardships that they're suffering. And many of them are blaming it on both their government as well as the sanctions. And some are saying, we want to get rid of our government, but we are so afraid of what the US is doing. So it's very sad, but it's very important that we hear directly from Iranians. And I wrote this book on Iran because there is a saying that war is the way that Americans learn geography. And there's unfortunately a lot of truth to that. And we worked so hard to try to stop the war in Iraq. And I bet a lot of you did here too, and tried to stop Canadian involvement. Raise your hand if you were involved in something to try to stop it. Huh? What? What did you say?
wasn't really involved, just not officially anyway.
So we worked very hard in the US to try to stop that war, and we were obviously very unsuccessful. But it is quite remarkable that today, looking at over 17 years of war in Afghanistan, still haven't defeated the Taliban. 16 years of war in Iraq and the devastation that has caused, and seeing US intervention in Libya, seeing what's happening in Syria, that anybody would contemplate another military intervention is just quite astounding and shows that they have absolutely no interest in what is good for the Iranian people. And so when I wrote the book, it really is part of this effort that we've got to educate more people, especially the American people, to say, let's open our eyes and figure out how we're going to stop our government from dragging us into another war. So the book goes into some of the history of Iran, which is, an absolute, very, very difficult task to put 2,500 years of history into a small chapter. But it was important for me to show that Iran has this long and amazing culture and richness and beautiful literature and poetry and architecture and a sophisticated society. And then to show in more modern history what the Western world did to destroy the aspirations of the Iranian people to control their own resources. And how ironic is it when the US is going on and on about Russian interference in our elections to not do a little history lesson and talk about things like the 1953 coup, when a democratically elected government, elected with a massive following and a mandate from the people to say, our oil should be our oil and should be used to benefit the Iranian people and not the British, because it was a company that became British Petroleum. And the British went to the United States and said, we cannot let this bad example happen, because this will be taken up by other countries that will want their own resources too, and convince the United States to get involved and to overthrow the government of Mohammad Mossadegh. And that's absolutely critical for people to understand. Because what happened after the overthrow of that government directly leads to the government that's in place today. Because the Shah came back in, even more repressive than before. The US sold more and more weapons to Iran. In fact, in the late 1960s, Iran became the #1 purchaser of US weapons, and that went on in the 70s. And what were those weapons used for? To repress the Iranian people. And where was the only place where people could organize and mobilize? It was in the mosques. And that's how the clerics got the upper hand when people finally overthrew the government in 1979. It could have been a secular democratic government. But who was organized? It was the clerics. And so they managed to take control. And that government was not only anti-Shah, but rightly so, it was anti-American. And so the consequences of what was considered that time a successful coup, in fact so successful that that same model of covert action was used a year later in Guatemala to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz, was used a couple of years after that in 1960 in the Congo to overthrow the democratically elected government of Patrice Lumumba, was tried the next year to overthrow the government of Cuba unsuccessfully in 1961. But this, quote, successful coup led to consequences that the Iranian people have been suffering for ever since. And the takeover of the US Embassy that happened right after the revolution led to the US cutoff in diplomatic relations and led to US sanctions that have been in place in one form or another for about 40 years now. And the negative relations between the Iranian government, the US, and the Western world in general continue. And that's why it was so important under the Obama administration that the nuclear deal was negotiated. And when Brian Hook talked yesterday, he acted as if this was a negotiation between two countries, just the US and Iran, and it wasn't a treaty, so it wasn't very important. Well, hello, this was negotiations that was not just between the US and Iran. It was between the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China. It was approved by the entire European Union and unanimously by the UN Security Council. And it wasn't a treaty in the US only because Obama knew with the partisanship that existed at that time as well, that he didn't have the votes to pass it in the Senate by 2/3, which is what you need for a treaty. So it was an executive agreement. And that was the fatal flaw of the Iran nuclear deal. Because then while Trump, during his campaign, trashed the deal, saying this is the worst deal ever, and he wanted to destroy any of the positive things of the Obama legacy, whether it was the Paris Climate Accords or the healthcare bill or the diplomatic relations with Cuba or this nuclear deal with Iran, he could come in and easily just tear up that deal, which is what he did. And this is despite the fact that the other signatories to the deal wanted and continue to want it to be in force. This is despite the fact that the Iranians were upholding their end of the deal. And instead of siding with our allies in Europe, our allies in the whole European Union, Russia and China, what did the Trump administration do? They listened to the two countries that were against this deal with Iran from the very beginning. One of them, Israel, that had lobbied hard against the deal. In fact, John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State negotiating the deal, he said that the Israelis would constantly come to him and say, don't sign any deal with Iran, you can't trust the Iranians, bomb them instead. And the chutzpah of Netanyahu to be so vociferous about Iran's nuclear program is quite astounding, because let's be real, how many nuclear weapons does Iran have? Right, absolutely zero. How many nuclear weapons does Israel have?
200.
Somebody said 60, somebody said 100, somebody said 200. We don't know. And we don't know because Israel has been lying about its nuclear program since the 60s. Israel has never joined and would not join any non-proliferation treaty, would never allow any inspectors into their country. And yet Israel is the one advising Trump about nuclear weapons. And I don't know about you, I don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but I don't want Israel to have nuclear weapons, I don't want the US to have nuclear weapons, I don't want any of them. But imagine how some people in Iran feel, even if they don't want their country to get nuclear weapons, they say, why should we be the ones that are singled out for this? How hypocritical the whole thing is. And so you have the Israelis on the one side, and then you have Saudi Arabia. Talk about hypocritical. I mean, come on. Here they are going on and on about Iran being the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. There are many things in Iran's foreign policy that I do not like. I don't think it is a good thing that Iran is supporting the Assad regime. I don't think it is a good thing that Iran is involved in Shia militias that have been responsible for some very nasty ethnic cleansing in Iraq. I don't think it's a good thing that Iran gets involved in issues outside of its borders. But all right, we won't talk about the US for the moment, but talk about Saudi Arabia and who is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. I mean, it is the Wahhabi perversion of Islam that the Saudis have been spreading around the world that has formed the ideological basis for terrorist groups from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Boko Haram. I mean, it is certainly the Saudis right now with their unconscionable bombing of Yemen with US support and Canadian support that has been devastating for the Yemeni people. And yet here is the US government acting as if Iran is the only bad actor in the region and by far the worst actor in the region. And it's also funny that they're constantly using the term about meddling in the Middle East. When we say, they are in the Middle East. The US is not in the Middle East. We are the ones meddling in the Middle East. So Trump listens to Saudi Arabia. Trump listens to Israel and goes ahead with this idea of getting out of the nuclear deal. Now, this doesn't just affect issues around Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon. This is really about regime change in Iran. And the way they're doing it is by strangling the Iranian economy. Many Iranians say that one of the biggest problems of our economy in Iran is the corruption of government entities or government-related entities. There are revolutionary guards that own large sectors of the Iranian economy. There are clerical groups that own large sectors of the Iranian economy. But when you impose sanctions, what does it do? It strengthens those sectors because people have to look for things like on the black market. And who runs the black market? Those very groups. People have to look for the state for getting things that they can't get because they're choked off from getting access to dollars or imports. What does it mean to people who want to make changes inside Iran? They have to struggle to get medicines. They have to struggle to find food. They have to struggle with their daily lives. instead of doing things like building up a more vibrant civil society. It also means that the conservatives could then say it's the US fault, and can also use it as an excuse to crack down on the very civil society that many of us would like to be supporting. So the sanctions are promoting the conservatives, the clerics, the most reactionary elements of the Iranian society. And the sanctions are really hurting ordinary people. How do the sanctions function? It's not just that the US says, all right, US companies can't trade with Iran. I mean, that would be bad, but that would not be absolutely horrible because there are many other countries. But the sanctions say that anybody who deals with Iran cannot deal with the United States and cannot use dollars. And what is the currency that runs almost the entire international trading system? It is the dollar. So if companies have to decide, are they going to continue to deal with Iran or and potentially face very serious sanctions, they're not going to want to gamble with that. And so even though the Europeans are saying, we want to keep the deal in place, we want our companies to continue to deal with Iran, those companies have already pulled out. They're already in the process of pulling out. So big companies, like the oil companies, are pulling out of multi-billion-dollar deals. The car companies are pulling out. Airbus, that was selling civilian airplanes, very needed in Iran where they have such an old, dangerous fleet, pulling out of the deals. And it's interesting to see who is benefiting from this. Anybody want to take a guess at who benefits from in the trade? China. China's the one, absolutely. There was just an article in the New York Times today where it was an article gloating about how successful Trump has been with these sanctions. The sanctions have been put back in place, but another series of even more draconian sanctions will be put in place on November 5th. And that is that the Trump administration is going around the world saying, not only can you not trade and deal, you have your businesses doing business with Iran, but you can't buy any of Iran's oil. And of course, that is the #1 resource that Iran has. So there was a New York Times piece today gloating, saying even before November 5th, already all of these countries are saying, okay, we're not going to buy Iranian oil, we're not going to buy Iranian oil. And the Secretary of State himself is going around to these countries and strong-arming them and saying there will be repercussions if you keep buying Iranian oil. And so it's really only Russia that has its own oil and China that can afford to buck the sanctions because they can use banks that don't have to deal in dollars. So once again, we see the strangling of the Iranian economy, hurting the Iranian people with the goal of trying to spread so much discontent that the Iranian people will rise up. So there have been demonstrations. There was a series of them at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And then every month now, in fact, every week now, there are some demonstrations happening somewhere in Iran against the terrible economic situation. But many Iranian people, and I know we have some in this audience, and I look forward to a discussion, say, what would happen if the regime collapsed now? They look around the Middle East and they say, we don't want to be like Iraq, we don't want to be like Libya, we don't want to be like Syria, we don't want Iranians fighting Iranians, we don't want the secular versus the Islamists to be killing each other, the ethnic minority groups that the US has been channeling money to them and encouraging them to rise up. So they think, many Iranians think, we are better off working for reforms right now within the system than we are with an overthrow that could lead to more chaos. And let's face it, a war with Iran if the US actually was stupid enough to get involved militarily would be absolutely catastrophic. I mean, this is a country of 80 million people with a lot of people with weapons, a well-trained military, a well-developed military, but it's also a place where they have been planning for this for a long time. They're not just sitting around waiting. They've already insinuated that they could really wreak havoc with oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. They've already talked about how they are surrounded by US military bases. In fact, there's a great slide that I love that says, Iran wants war, here's the proof. They've positioned themselves all around the US military base. And so Iranians have been planning, where can they attack the US? They can attack the US in Afghanistan. They can attack the US in neighboring Iraq. They can make things miserable for the US in many of those bases all over the place. And of course, they can have their allies like Hezbollah attacking Israel, causing more chaos than we have right now. So I think when we look at the situation, we realize how grave, how dangerous it is, and how the Trump administration, maybe they need a big distraction from all the chaos that they have internally right now. Maybe a war might be one of those distractions. We can't let that happen. And so I think it's important for us to be figuring out what are the measures that we can take. In the US, we're trying to find allies within our Congress, and it is not easy because Iran has been so demonized. The pro-Israel Netanyahu lobby is so strong in the United States that anything that looks like you are being sympathetic towards Iran is then labeled as anti-Semitism. And the Democrats that rallied hard during Obama's presidency to get support for the Iran nuclear deal have been basically silent now when Trump has taken the US out of this deal. So we are working very hard to trying to get some brave senators, some brave Congress people to put forward some bills, some resolutions. There was one that did pass in one of the chambers, but not the other, that said that the president does not have the authority to intervene militarily in Iran without first going to Congress, which is a little scary given the Congress that we have. But it basically is reiterating what the Constitution says, which is that it's not the executive that has the power to declare war. Even that has been very difficult to get through our Congress. So we face an uphill battle on that. We need allies. We need allies in Canada. We need allies in Europe. We need there to be a much stronger global movement like there was around Iraq. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful at that time, but we got to try again because we don't have an alternative. We have to have a global movement that says we say no to another war. So, the other thing we hope to do is to educate people about Iranians, because I don't know how it is here. I think you have a much more tolerant, actually nicer society in Canada than we have in the US. But in the US, all of this anti-Iran sentiment translates into Iranians are terrorists. And you might have heard of the Muslim ban that President Trump has put in place that stops people from other countries coming into the United States. Well, it's framed in this idea that this is to keep Americans safe from people who might want to harm us. We might wonder, well, it's a terrible thing to do. We shouldn't have a ban on any people from a country. But if you were to pick a country where people have done us harm, where would you pick? Which one would you pick? Saudi Arabia, okay? 15 of the 19 hijackers from Saudi Arabia. A lot of the terrorist attempts in the United States throughout these years have had some connection to Saudi Arabia or to Saudi ideology. You know how many of them have been connected to Iran attempts in the United States? Zero, absolutely zero. But Iran is on the list of the banned, where people from that country can't get in. Saudi Arabia is not. And so all of this contributes to, one, very difficult times for Iranians. They have a hard time figuring out how they're going to see their family members. How can they come to the United States for scholarships if they've gotten to U.S. universities? If they're students studying in the United States, they're afraid to go home and visit their families because they're afraid they can't get back in again. And so we have a lot of work in the United States to do to humanize the Iranian people. And we're doing that through a campaign that we're starting now, talking to Iranians through social media. And it was great to have this because now we've got like thousands of Iranians that want to talk to us. And we're starting this campaign where we tape messages that we put on Instagram and on all the different social media. We have script in Farsi of things that we can say to them. We ask them to talk back to us. We're asking people to watch Iranian movies, to eat Iranian food, to learn about Iranian poetry, about Rumi, about Hafez, to do something to spread a love for the Iranian people. And it might sound silly in Canada, but we have to do that kind of thing in the United States because people are really ignorant and fall prey to the demonization of entire people. You know, most of the places I've traveled around the world, even if the U.S. had been hammering that place for a long time, the people inside would say, we understand there's a difference between the people and the government. But in the United States, you really oftentimes don't get that. So we have to do that kind of humanization campaign. And we are trying to get a big delegation, like a permission from the Iranians to take about 100 people to Iran. Thank you, and we'd like to make that international, people from Canada, people from Europe. So these are some of the ideas that we have. And I look forward to a discussion with you so we can think together of other ways that we can work to try to stop yet another disastrous war in the Middle East. So thank you very much. Iranian in some, either Canadian Iranian, so partially? Can we see that again? Wonderful, it's so great to have a number of you here. I'd like to start out with any of you from, with Iranian heritage who might want to start the conversation.
First of all, thank you very much for all your activism. I've been watching most of what you've been doing in the United States, especially the past couple of days with the conference that happened in the United States and the issue with imposing sanctions against Iran. But what I probably wanted to share with the rest of the audience, and my friend is also here to talk about, is how also Canada plays a role in that regard. In the last administration, the Harper government, the Conservative government, they were also under the influence of most of the strong Israeli lobbies in Canada, and they seceded relations with Iran, and they basically closed down the Iranian embassy. And basically that became part of the campaign of demonizing and cornering Iran. We have an organization here, the Iranian Canadian Congress, which my friend is one of the members and used to be the president of that organization, that is trying to basically advocate on behalf of many Iranians here who want to still continue relations with Iran and basically have a dialogue with Iran because the relations are now broken. And that has become basically, we have put together a petition that actually attracted over 17,000 signatures asking the government of Canada to mend relations with Iran. So that kind of activism also exists in Canada, but we need more support. Right now, Canada is also having negotiations with the United States in regards to NAFTA, and the issue with Iran is unfortunately ignored to some extent. So that kind of an idea needs to be revitalized so that we can keep the dialogue going on And again, thank you very much for coming to Canada and visiting us and talking to us. And I really look forward to have more discussions and dialogues with you as well.
Do you have that petition here that we can pass around? Or,
The petition was closed actually, so we started that petition, I believe, 2 years ago, I believe it was. It had a window of 3 months, and within that 3 months, we were able to raise almost over 16,000, I believe, signatures. And that actually, and one of the MPs, like one of the representatives of the parliament endorsed that. And it was, I believe, discussed in the parliament. The Trudeau government is much willing to mend relations with Iran, but unfortunately there are very strict, I would say, hurdles on the way to reopen the embassy, because the previous government basically created an immunity act, which now is put against the Iranian diplomats. No account for the Iranians, especially the Iranian diplomats, can be opened in Canada. So it's really hard to get back to the same situation before 2012 when the Iranian embassy was open here. But we need to, again, as you mentioned, we need to have that discussion going on, especially now that the Trump administration is trying to really demonize Iran in the Middle East. So again, thank you very much.
And if they want to connect with the organization, is there a website?
I have a friend here who can actually help you out in that regard.
Yeah, so first I wanted to actually thank you for what you did. I think it was yesterday at the Hudson Institute when you protested against Brian Hook. So as an Iranian Canadian, I wanted to thank you for that. I know many Iranians were happy to see that kind of protest happening. The organization that Mehdi, my friend, talked about is called Iranian Canadian Congress. The website is iccongress.ca. Many organizations that are active in the United States, for example, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a hawkish, really warmonger, lobbying for more pressure and sanctions on Iran. They're active in Canada as well. I think the most important thing, if we want to advocate for peace and for more influence from Canada on this issue, for example, is to talk to our members of parliament. There are actually tools available on our website, which you can check. There are articles and information. If you want to approach your members of parliament, then talk to them and ask them to bring this issue up with the government to ensure that they also add their voice for peace and diplomacy with Iran. So thank you for the time, and I'll definitely come to the front to see if we can pass our information, contact information, and be in touch together.
Fabulous. I'm so glad you're here, and thank you so much for the work you're doing. I also wonder if any of the Iranians want to comment on a phenomena in the United States. I don't know how it is among Canadians, which is government officials and former government officials in bed with the MEK, Mujahideen Macabre. This is an organization, well, maybe I'll let some of you talk about it. Yeah, you want to talk about the MEK?
Well, MEK is...
Can people hear? Do you mind standing?
MEK is an organization which was recognized by the world as a terrorist organization. And of course, during the Shah, they were active, and they even killed 3 Americans in Iran. And then they moved to Iraq. During the war, they supported Saddam Hussein, and they actually asked all of their members to go there, and they lived there for a number of years, and they were supported by Saddam Hussein. And they started even fighting the government in Iran indirectly. But then they went to bed with CIA and American government, and American government removed their brand of terrorism, and they welcomed them all over the world. They started getting out of Iraq and distributing them all everywhere in the world. Some of them were in Toronto or Chicago or in the US. And they worked very closely with the American government. So they get financial support. I don't know if you have seen some of the YouTube. John Bolton goes there every year and gives a talk and gets $180,000 for half an hour talk. So they go, different senators, they go there, mayors go there. Every year they meet and they invite all these politicians to go there. I don't know where the hell they get their money, but they pay them to go there and give 15 minutes talk.
Well, thank you so much for a great explanation. And, it is just mind-boggling that so many officials in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, are trying to rehabilitate an organization that has virtually no support within Iran, right? Even among people who hate the Iranian government. Is that, am I correct here?
It's more of a cult.
Huh?
It's a cult.
It's a cult, yeah. And you want to explain why you call it a cult?
Well, it's a cult because they don't have any base within the Iranian society. And the reason the US is, some of the US, not all of them, I think Obama completely distanced himself from this organization, this cult. But those who do it, they basically want to use it as a weapon of pressure on the Iranian government to gain concession. It's not, they clearly know that this organization has no base.
So
They get money to come to the lectures, but at the same time they use them as an element, as a tool of political pressure on the Iranian regime.
yeah, I wouldn't say that Obama distanced himself because it was under Obama that they were taken off the terrorist list when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State.
Yeah, but Obama as a whole distanced himself from this organization. But Obama would not use them as a tool of pressure.
And today we have the high-ranking liberal Democrat in the Congress, Nancy Pelosi, some of you might know Nancy Pelosi, who sends her greetings to the MEK in their annual meetings. And what? Yeah, no, it's just, and so they're trying to act like the MEK could be a legitimate government that could take over. Or they're using it, as you say, for pressure. Whatever the case is, it's really shameful how they are making an alliance with a group that is known inside Iran as one that is was a traitor during their really bloody war with Iran.
But
So-
there are horror stories about this cult. There are lots of videos on YouTube talking about how they treated their own members.
And you can't leave once you've gotten in. And there's a great one I just saw that Channel 4 in London did that you might want to look up that interviews people who have managed to escape and how they were brainwashed and they weren't allowed to get married. You had to be celibate because you had to love the Madame Rojava and the leaders. Anyway. Let's broaden the discussion. Is there anyone else from the Iranian community that wants to say anything before we open it up to?
I would like to ask a question from you. When you went to Iran, whom did you talk to about the future of Iran? Did you talk to reformers or did you talk to, whom did, you don't have to mention names, but broadly speaking, what were they? Because I'm asking this question only because some of the reformers, they scare people, saying that, oh, if we get rid of this regime, then Iran would be like Syria. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I don't think there would be a kind of ethnic war within Iran. I don't think so. But there might be problems substituting, but I don't think there will be a problem like Iraq, Syria. Because most of Iran is, Iranian politics is kind of city-based. It's not like Kelan or Karayiba.
So I don't know if everybody can hear, but he was saying he doesn't think there would be like ethnic wars in Iran. And asked who we meet with when we go to Iran. I mean, we try to talk to whoever we can talk to, and both people that our minders want us to meet with, as well as how we escape our minders, as we have done, and then talk to people on the street who love to talk. And As you well know, one of the great things about Iran is if you say you're American, they just love you and really want to talk to you. As a Jewish American, I was first worried about saying I was Jewish and tried it out and realized people love Jews in Iran. If they are religious, they love you because they say, oh, we're people of the same book and we have the same kind of traditions. And I'm like, yeah, right. I'm not a practicing Jew, so I don't really know what they are. But and then if they're secular, they say, "Oh, we love Hollywood and the Jewish influence and this and that." So we talk to whoever we can talk to. The issue around the ethnic minorities worries me because I know the U.S. has been fomenting discontent among the ethnic minorities, and Iran is very interesting because most of the ethnic minorities feel Iranian first, and then the ethnicity second. But I'll just give you an example because we spend a lot of time in Congress, and much of the time we make our office the cafeteria in Congress just to see what's going on, right, Baki? And the other day we were sitting around at the cafeteria, and I had a shirt on that said "Peace with Iran." And this group asked me to come over, and they said, "What do you mean, peace with Iran?" And I said, "You know, we don't want to go to war." And they said, "You support the regime." And so we started talking, and each one of them at this table was a different ethnic minority group in Iran. They were all brought over by the U.S. State Department. They were all given money by the U.S. State Department, and it is for increasing, you know, their sense of ethnic rights. And so I think part of the U.S. Has been for years is covert actions, and certainly one of that is trying to stir up.
It won't be successful.
Let's hope not. Yes.
I personally think that Saudi Arabia and Israel have put lots of effort in the ethnic minorities in Iran, so I personally find it dangerous. Exactly like Yugoslavia, the moment that the central government falls apart, these ethnic minorities that have been helped by Israel and Saudi Arabia for the past 30 years, they are going to try to separate. I find it dangerous.
Yeah. So let's open it up now to anybody who has questions, comments. Yes.
As for Canada, Netanyahu or the Israelis have an incredible influence on our government.
Could you speak a little louder?
Netanyahu or Israel has incredible influence on our government. So there's, yes, so there's a lot of work to be done there.
And is there anybody who works around the that issue that wants to talk about what people are doing and what you can do? It might be around the Solidarity Palestine issue. Any Canadians here who work on that?
Yeah, well,
Can you maybe speak for?
so there are, probably a lot of you know about organizations like Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, so CJPME. It's an excellent organization that has tremendous information and holds conferences and so on, but there are also a lot of Palestine solidarity movements. We're from Montreal, and we're constantly on the street for Palestine. So there are currents, but I totally agree with that assessment. And Netanyahu and Israel have a lot of power with the Trudeau government as well, and that's right.
The NDP and the Trudeau government, the Liberals, won't even recognize the Palestinians, as the NDP used to in the past, but you can't get any commitment from them now.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to mention that it's also very important to have, and it is the case that a lot of the Palestine solidarity work here is done by people who are not Palestinian, who are not, a lot of progressive Jewish people, Holocaust survivors who are very active, and that is really critical because the pressures on people of color, on Arabs, on Muslims who are vocal in this country and in many other countries is severe, and we're scared. And we need other people to be raising their voices. So thank you for doing that, and please continue.
Want to answer this?
I know this is about Iran, but in 1893, the Zionist Manifesto declared that the land of Canaan shall be from the Nile to the Euphrates. And I'm wondering, from your experience, having been around it, you and I have been in Cairo and in Gaza, and how much influence behind the scenes is Israel having on Iraq, Iran, all this Middle East, because their expansionist concept to gain control of this entire land of Canaan?
Yes, I think as people in this audience have said, there is a tremendous influence of Israel and tremendous pressure that Israel puts on other governments. And it's also worrisome now to see the way that Saudi Arabia and Israel are working together, and to see the way that the Russians are working with the Israelis as well. The Russians potentially could play a positive role with their relations with Iran and with Israel, but they are getting close to the Israelis on a number of issues. So it is extremely dangerous, and certainly when we see how the Israelis negotiated with the US that in exchange for Obama signing the